Thank you very much, Kate. Thanks so much for inviting me, and also Rosie. And I hugely appreciate your attitude to education, that it's all about having a debate and sharing information. I think it's an enlightened attitude that many schools could follow in New Zealand. It's great. So I've got an enormous amount of information, and I've tried to narrow it down to try and make it a bit more palatable, but at the end I'll answer any questions to the best of my ability. So if there's anything I don't cover that you would like me to cover, please feel free to ask me. Wi-Fi and BYO devices have recently developed almost cult status in New Zealand schools, and internet is regarded as an essential tool for learning. I myself couldn't do the research I do without internet. None of this is anti-technology. It's all about understanding the risks associated with technology and finding better ways to use the technology that we all want to use so that it minimises risks. So the whole purpose here is looking at what we do know, looking at what we don't know, and trying to prioritise things to find a good way of doing the things that we all want to do, or most of us want to do. The government's funding a massive rollout of Wi-Fi, and Wi-Fi and internet is no longer used just for technology studies, but it's now used as a medium for pretty much every subject at school, or at least at the schools that my children go to, and no doubt here as well. It's a great resource, and none of this is negative to technology. But what's happening overseas is Wi-Fi, as we're rolling it out happily in New Zealand, overseas in Europe and Asia particularly, they're removing Wi-Fi from schools and replacing it with hardwired Ethernet. There's been numerous warnings from numerous communities. The Parliamentary Council of Europe, which I think represents 77 European countries, has recommended that precaution is required with electromagnetic radiation. France is just a long way through passing laws. They've got 2 layers of courts in France. They've gone through the lowest court with a whole new law about Wi-Fi and technology in schools, requiring it to be removed from the lower level junior schools, and it's well in its way through the senior schools, removing a law requiring Wi-Fi to be removed. Israel's got the laws and got the government policies requiring Wi-Fi to be removed. Some parents were not happy that it was taking too long. They went to the Supreme Court of Israel. The Supreme Court of Israel's issued what's an indicative decision saying that the government had a month to explain why it wasn't possible to remove all the Wi-Fi by a certain date. The government's asked for an extension of time. That decision, the government submission's due any time now. It was due a couple of weeks ago, but they've got an extension for that. So they've gone through to the highest court there, and the highest court has said, yes, there are health effects from Wi-Fi, we understand that. Why is the government taking so long to get its Wi-Fi out of schools? In Switzerland, the Swiss telco there, who's a government telco, Swisscom, have funded Ethernet in all of their schools so they don't need Wi-Fi, and partly for health effects, partly also because it's faster and more reliable, so they want the best for their students. Similarly, Frankfurt in Germany, they've never had Wi-Fi. They were concerned about the health effects from day one. They passed a correspondence from the government departments prohibiting Wi-Fi in any of their schools. Bavaria, the same type of thing. They're only states in Germany, but the population in those states are massive compared to the population of the entire New Zealand. And Russia, which we normally don't really look at for its human rights, has got far stricter standards for electromagnetic radiation than New Zealand, or for that matter any of the countries, Australia, England, Canada and America, that are sort of hardcore, that are trying to pretend that electromagnetic radiation is useful, so it must be okay. Russia, interestingly, it's never been a commercial thing there. It's always been a military use, and they developed their guidelines based on the known effects of radiation. They recognised the harm from microwaves. They actually recommended against using microwave ovens in Russia because of the health effects associated with microwave ovens, and they've carried it through on other microwave technology. They've got 100 times more strict standard than we've got in New Zealand. And so these international concerns are about the reliability of Wi-Fi and security of information on Wi-Fi. There's also the speed of Wi-Fi downloads compared to Ethernet, but also safety. And the safety issue is the issue that I'm most interested in today. But the gist of it is there is an alternative, hardwired Ethernet, faster, safer and more reliable. For the simple action of plugging in your computer when you need it, balanced against the risks associated with radiation that's causing all sorts of known and unknown effects, my submission is it's no contest, but it's for you all to decide obviously what suits you and your children and your school. So why are there safety concerns about Wi-Fi? What is it about Wi-Fi? Well, Wi-Fi is a type of radio frequency electromagnetic radiation. It's a source of energy and it's part of the spectrum of energy. We've got visible light, we've got infrared, we've got ultraviolet, we've got radar, and Wi-Fi and radio waves are at the longer end of the spectrum, so 10 centimetre long waves up to 1 kilometre long waves. They're long waves and they traditionally were regarded as being, well, they are lower frequency. They were regarded as being lower energy, and so they weren't regarded as being ionising. So the shorter waves were regarded as being ionising, which means that they could change the status of atoms, knock electrons off atoms, and they were known to cause changes to DNA and changes to the body. Traditionally, the longer waves are thought to be safe. However, over time, that thinking's well and truly changed, and I'll give some more explanation in a moment. But what's very clear now is that microwaves, radio waves, although they're longer, they do have wide-ranging biological effects on the human body. They affect cells, they affect the cell membranes and what can pass through the cell membranes. They affect the DNA in cells. In fact, they use radiation now for some scientific experiments to deliberately damage the cells so that they can do all sorts of other experiments on them. They found it was a really easy way of damaging the cells so that they could test them with all sorts of other chemicals. So that was an inadvertent use of it, but it proves the concern that DNA is harmed and cell membranes are harmed from electromagnetic radiation, and particularly from radio frequency radiation. Radio frequency electromagnetic radiation affects the hormones in the body, the way your body has stress reactions to different things, and it affects brain function. And when you're coming to look at educating your children, you want to be looking pretty carefully about something that changes brain function, it changes concentration, it changes sleep. It basically is thought to have a dumbing down effect on the ability to think. So it's a sort of a sedative. Pulsed waves used in technology, in the modern technology, packages information differently than the naturally occurring waves. So it's really interesting. Some of the biggest effects from electromagnetic radiation have been shown to be of the wavelengths that are quite similar to the natural wavelengths in the body. And the theory is that your body's trying to interpret this electromagnetic information, thinking it's a message telling you to run or jump or hide because there's a tiger coming or whatever, whereas it's actually an external message that's got nothing to do with risk, but your body, because it's a similar frequency and wavelength, your body's trying to interpret it and it's giving itself nonsense messages and creating stress reactions. But on the other end of the spectrum, there's concern that the way that some of the cell phones particularly are packaged, the way the information's packaged, is completely unnatural, and that also is having unexpected and unknown effects on the body. But because officially the governments aren't recognising any of the effects, no one's doing any research to look at whether there might be better ways or better wavelengths used. There may well be better choices for cell phones and radiation that have less impact on the body, but that's the type of research that we could be doing once we recognise that what we're doing at the moment is not healthy for us. Now, Wi-Fi, it's pretty well accepted now that Wi-Fi, and as with other sources of radio frequency radiation, can be harmful. The heating effects of radio frequency radiation are well accepted. It's been known for many decades that very high doses of radio frequency radiation cause death burns and electric shocks. It basically kills you. It cooks your cells and it kills you. There are now, however, over 6,000 published studies showing the biological impacts from radio frequency pollution as well. And the biological effects happen at much, much, much lower levels than the heating effects. They are this more subtle effects. They change the way the cell membranes work, the cell proteins work, the balance between different forms of proteins that are naturally in your cells. So proteins could change from a sort of an on form to an off form. And so with radiation, it can change that balance. Can cause harm to DNA and particularly to both strands of the DNA. So when it replicates, it hasn't got a pattern to replicate to, and so it just basically has to invent DNA to fix the gaps. And other known biological effects are effects on hormone function. So the analogy between the heating effects and the biological effects, when you look at UV light, heating effect, you get sunburn. You cook, your skin cooks and it goes red and it burns. The biological effect of UV light is melanoma. No obvious effect on the day, but it's caused subtle changes in your body, and over time they cause long-term tumours and other effects. So that's the type of difference between the heating effect from microwaves and Wi-Fi and other types of electromagnetic radiation, the heating effects and the biological effects. Now, I'll go on to it shortly, but the standard that we've got in New Zealand at the moment only protects against the heating effects. It completely ignores all of the biological effects, which when it was written in 1999, it was controversial enough. However, what's happened since then is in May 2011, the World Health Organization and IARC, which is the international organisation that looks at cancers, reclassified radiofrequency electromagnetic radiation as a Class 2B carcinogen. Now, Class 2B is a possible carcinogen. It doesn't mean that they were absolutely conclusive, but it's much more than some of the other categories where there's a few things that they've excluded completely as carcinogens. It's an active decision that there's enough evidence of concern that it needs to be recognised as a possible carcinogen. It's based on a significant volume of material. They had a meeting with a whole large number of, I think about 20 world experts, and as a result of that they prepared what are called the IARC monographs, which explains all the research that they used as to why they reclassified radiation as a Class 2B carcinogen. 427 pages of science explaining all this. It is the only Class 2B carcinogen that is deliberately transmitted into our community. The other ones are industrial and agricultural chemicals, industrial solvents and pesticides and that type of thing that are used under really strict conditions. But for some reason, we have a crazy situation in New Zealand where we've got a Class 2B carcinogen that we're actively transmitting all through our community, through our homes, through our schools, through our workplaces, our hospitals, everywhere. And there's been a real disconnect, which I'll come on to, between this classification by the World Health Organization and the government's response in New Zealand. But it's a hugely significant thing to deliberately transmit a Class 2B carcinogen. Meanwhile, just this year, the World Health Organization's put out their latest cancer report, recognising that world cancer levels are increasing exponentially from environmental causes. There are inadequate resources to treat cancers. They said we must focus on prevention. We do not have the resources in the world to treat cancers at the increasing rate that they're occurring. They didn't pin down the causes of the increasing rates of cancers. They said it's probably environmental causes. They said it might be obesity. They said various other causes. They didn't explain, they've knocked out tobacco from the system largely. They didn't explain what the other environmental causes are. There's a lot of political lobbying that goes on behind the scenes that makes it fairly unpalatable to link radiation, which is coming from some of the biggest multinational companies in the world, to the causes, but it's not a huge leap of logic to say, well, what's changed so much in the last 20 or so years? Could it be the radiation that we are deliberately exposing ourselves to? And what you have to remember with cancer is there's a latent period. Depending on the cancer, the latent period varies, but the latent period is the period between exposure and when it shows up in your body. So if you had the exposure, it typically takes at least 10 years between the time of the exposure and the time of cancer. So you smoke cigarettes in the 50s, by the 70s, there's sort of people start to get more cancer, the 80s more and more, and then people go, oh, gee, I wonder if that's linked. So it doesn't show up today, tomorrow, next week, next month. It takes time, and we just have to look at what information we've got and what signals we've got to try and link it all together. But in the meantime, there can be considerable harm done. The interphone study, which is one of the studies that the World Health Organization relied on, the interphone study was a study done in numerous countries around the world looking at brain tumours that may have been linked to cell phones. It was a study that was curiously designed, let us say, bearing in mind the latent period of 10 years, that they were only looking at a 10-year span, so they were only looking at basically people who had been using cell phones for 10 years but not for any longer than 10 years. But even with that very short-term study, in what they called the heavy users, which were people that use cell phones 30 minutes a day, which isn't particularly heavy user compared to what some people use it, even in that they found a significant increase in brain tumours on the side of the head where the people typically use their cell phone, and in many cases with the tumour matching up where the antennae was on the cell phone. So it was arguably a study that was designed to not show any effect because it was such a short-term study compared to the latent period, but even then it did show an effect. So the fact that it didn't show any effect for people that had only been using a cell phone for 2 years or 5 years is completely irrelevant, because with the latent period you're never going to find an effect, just as you don't with asbestos or tobacco. But with the long-term users, that's the interesting part. And there's been some more studies done recently on the 15-year users, and I haven't personally seen those studies yet, but I understand they show an increasing effect of brain tumours. There's also a doctor in Sydney, Dr. Charlie Teo, who's a really highly regarded brain surgeon. He's made quite a few announcements of concern about the increasing number of brain tumours that he's been operating on. So from his perspective, there's been an unexplained incidence in brain tumours associated, he believes, with cell phones. There's also been some litigation starting at various stages around the world linking cell phones to brain tumours. The difficult thing, of course, is we're all exposed to a whole range of different radiation. To prove that it was caused by your cell phone and not by your old cell phone that might have been manufactured by a different company, or not by the cell tower next to your bedroom, or not by the Wi-Fi on your desk, it gets really, really complicated with evidence. But those cases are starting to come through the system where people are blaming their cell phones for their brain tumours, or often it's the wife of a deceased husband who died of a brain tumour, or vice versa, obviously, because the person with a brain tumour is not there to run the litigation. But all of the evidence is pointing in the direction that cell phones after the limitation, the latent period, are causing brain tumours, that if you're looking at it at a cell level, that radiation causes harm to DNA. It's all part of the same picture. It's all consistent. And we have to learn. We can't wait another 10, 20, 30, 40 years to prove it 100%. We've got the evidence now. We've got the mechanisms now to start thinking about alternatives. You know, we've got to learn from tobacco and asbestos and all PCBs and all the other nasties that we've used that we didn't learn from. We've got the opportunity to learn sooner rather than later. So that's why the latent period is really important, because it tends to confuse the research if you don't understand what it's all about. We've also got a very good scientist in New Zealand called Dr. Mary Redmayne, who recently completed her PhD on electromagnetic radiation. She had a background of being a teacher and of working as a physicist, and she started a master's degree but decided it was so interesting she turned it into a PhD at Victoria University. She studied the use of cell phones and cordless phones because cordless phones use the same technology. They're no safer than cell phones. She studied the usage in intermediate age children in Wellington. She studied almost every school in the Wellington area, and she did a really in-depth analysis of the amount of time kids were using cell phones. She came up with a lot of recommendations and conclusions affecting children's sleep. If they slept with a cell phone next to their bed, there's something about the electromagnetic radiation that interferes with the sleep hormone. But she also said that the amount of exposure that those intermediate age children were getting, if they continued that on, they would already be at increased risk of tumours by the age of 15. Now, her research has been published around the world, and she's been invited to numerous conferences. She's done some world-leading research. She's working over at Monash University now in Melbourne, and she's really concerned. She's very concerned. And if you think Mary's warning's bad enough, there are some experts who are giving even stronger warnings. Barry Trower, who's a physicist, he worked for the Royal Navy in England and the British Secret Services. There's a lot of information from him on YouTube if anyone's interested. He's incredibly concerned, having studied microwave use in warfare, that was his background, and having been asked a series of questions by people that he worked with and linking information. If you install Wi-Fi, what you're really saying to your female students and staff is, I'm offering you no more than a 40% chance of giving birth to a live child or a 40% chance of giving birth to a child who does not have a genetic disability or wasting disease. And that is the good news. The bad news is that you do give birth and there is a genetic defect, this will carry on for every generation thereafter until your line is no more. And that's because any damage to the DNA is carried through generation after generation. Barry's an amazing guy. He's retired, he lives in England, and he's publicly available as a resource. He feels so strongly about it. He gives his time freely to anybody that's got any questions, and he publishes the information that he can publish to try and get the word out. He feels so strongly. Now, completely different concern, if the cancer side of things is not bad enough, is the issue of electrosensitivity. Electrosensitivity, it typically seems to happen, it's like an allergic reaction. It typically happens to people who have either had excessive doses of electromagnetic radiation or to people who are quite sensitive to other things. They often have chemical sensitivities and other things. It showed up first in Sweden in the people who worked in the Nokia factory making cell phones. And their highly experienced, highly valued technicians started dropping like flies with serious headaches and stress reactions and all sorts of reactions. And as a result of that, and a fairly sympathetic government minister, they did quite a bit of research into it, and they linked it to this syndrome, electrosensitivity. And it appears that, and it's slightly theory, but it's largely based on what's happening. It appears that everybody has got their own resilience to electromagnetic radiation. My resilience will be different to yours, to yours, to yours. So it's partly dependent on your natural resilience, and it's partly dependent on what dosage you've had. Now, if you exceed your personal dose, you will get electrosensitive to at least that frequency that you've had your overdose in. Now, if you become electrosensitive, life in New Zealand is not very nice. I've done a lot of work for electrosensitives in New Zealand. They can't go in a public library because there's Wi-Fi, it makes them ill. They can't sit on a bus if someone's talking on a cell phone, it gives them a headache. They can't think straight. I did a lot of work for a lady in Christchurch, very, very intelligent lady, but if she'd been next to the radio tower that had made her ill, she couldn't assemble her thoughts. She couldn't get a straight sentence out. It's estimated to affect 3 to 10% of the population. So if you've got a class of 40, On average, you're going to have a couple of kids in your class, or kids and teacher, who are electrosensitive or who are prone to become electrosensitive. Headaches, difficulty concentrating, blurred vision, irregular heartbeat, stress reactions. In Canada, after they rolled out Wi-Fi in schools, they started to get a series of children having cardiac arrests. And they had to bring defibrillators into every school. Now, it's strongly suspected that it's linked to the Wi-Fi, and the kids that are electrosensitive, their heartbeats become irregular, and so this has become a whole new problem, never a problem in the schools prior to Wi-Fi. All of a sudden, a whole lot of kids, otherwise healthy kids, having these major heart problems. Overseas, it's recognised in many countries now as for worker compensation, people that get sick on the job. It's absolutely painful, isolating, because you can't go to normal places and hang out with your friends and do normal things. In New Zealand at the moment, there are no safe zones. We're pushing hard to get what are called white zones, where it's an area that's protected from excess radiation, so that people who are electrosensitive can go and live, and they know that no one's going to build a cell tower next door or put Wi-Fi in their house or any of these other things. Working with the Human Rights Commission to try and get that established, but it's taking some time. In terms of Wi-Fi in schools, electrosensitivity clearly does not facilitate learning. So if you've got two kids in your class who can't learn because they can't concentrate or they've got headaches or whatever from the Wi-Fi, it's clearly not beneficial, at least to them, and it's probably not beneficial to their classmates, and certainly not beneficial if the teacher's one of the ones who's electrosensitive. And I ask you to ask the question, I invite you to ask the question, in 20 years our children are saying, why did you deliberately expose us to Wi-Fi when you knew it could harm us? Take a step back. We love technology, we love the internet, we all mostly use it, but if we've got a choice, and we have all got a choice, why would we make the choice to expose ourselves to something that we know can harm us? So there's a huge community around the world. There's a huge number of researchers, there's academics, there are doctors, there are teachers, there are petitions, there are governments. All over the world, people are saying, we're worried about the rollout of Wi-Fi, we're going to pull back from it, we're going to restrict its use, we're going to look for alternatives. Ethernet's a great alternative, it's safe, it's secure, ticks all the boxes, just takes 2 seconds longer to plug it in and a wee bit more setup cost. That's the option. Unfortunately, in New Zealand, we have to have a look at what's going on, because we've got a problem here with the New Zealand government's approach at present, and we are working on it. The present is ignorance is bliss, seems to be the sort of catchphrase. The problem they've got is their own expert scientist, Dr. Sophie Walker, who works for the Crown Research Institute, ESR, was commissioned to do a review every 6 months of all of the international research on electromagnetic radiation and all of the studies. So the most recent one she did in August 2013, you can get it off the internet if you're interested, just Google Sophie Walker ESR. 22 of the 35 studies identified cancer or other biological harm from cell phones. That's pretty much 2/3 of them. 11 out of 11 studies found molecular and cellular effects from EMR. There are effects on melatonin, the sleep hormone in humans. There are effects on pacemakers. There are electrosensitivity effects. They're all biological effects. She did that review. She did a similar one in February 2013 on the earlier 6 months of research. But guess what? Her funding was canned, and she's told not to do any more of these reviews. By government. I've written to them. I've got it all under the OIA. So she's been decommissioned. And equally, I haven't covered it in here, but there's a thing called the government's Interagency Advisory Committee on the health effects of non-ionising radiation. They meet every 6 months. Their job is to look at all the international research and to advise the government if there's anything new that's come through the system that's important that the government needs to know about that might make it change its policy. Well, for some reason, the Interagency Advisory Committee on the health effects of radiation is not filled with doctors or medical experts or environmental experts. It's filled with people from the telcos, Ministry for Economic Development, a few other government departments that have sent people along. They've got no real qualification from the job. There was one doctor, but he was the doctor that was funded by the telcos, Dr. Black, who some of you may have seen on some of the media as Your Cell Phone Killing You, who by his own admission was employed by the telcos because they liked what he was going to say. There were a couple of consumer representatives, but under the Official Information Act, they told me it didn't matter. They didn't have any qualifications because their role was only to observe on process. Dr. Mary Redmayne, who we've spoken about, offered her services to the Interagency Advisory Committee. They said, no, thank you, we don't really need you on this committee. Dr. Sophie Walker, the government's own expert on biological effects of radiation. Sorry, no, you're not invited anymore to our committee. We don't want you here. So we have a government committee. We've been to the select committee about it in Parliament back in 2008, 2009. The select committee, every government party there, Greens, not only the Greens, New Zealand First, Labour, National, all on the select committee unanimously agreed we needed a review of the New Zealand standard and we needed a review of the composition of the Interagency Advisory Committee on the Health Effects of Radiation to make sure that there were more independent experts, more doctors, and to remove the vested interest. Every one of them agreed, but the minister of the time, our local MP, Nick Smith, decided that no, he wasn't going to follow that advice and he would just continue as things were. Thank you very much. So we've got an enormous problem in New Zealand where we're not getting the best international advice through to the people who make the decisions. There's kind of a roadblock in the middle. Yeah, they know, well, yeah, we got it through them, that's right, and they said, no, we're not interested. And since then, I mean, the Interagency Committee, their mandate is to advise on anything of significance. One might think that the May 2011 World Health Organisation reclassification as a Class 2B carcinogen might be something that the Minister of Health and the Minister of Environment might want to know about, but the Interagency Advisory Committee decided that it was not necessary to advise the Minister on that. For example, the Bio-Initiatives report, which is massive reports written in 2007, updated in 2011 and 2014, of a whole lot of scientists around the world on all aspects of radiation effects and benefits, was dismissed in one line by Dr. Black, who said, oh, it's just a review, doesn't matter. So all of that research is just getting blocked and it's not getting through to the people that are making the decision. So there is a debate about health effects from radiation. To me, it's actually not really a debate at all because you've got the two versions. You've got the version that are making money out of radiation, and then you've got the version that are being affected by the radiation, the people who are being affected. And at the moment in New Zealand, the people that are making the money are winning and the people who are being affected are being ignored, and the information that could change that is being blocked from the decision makers. It is incredibly difficult to conclusively prove harm from an environmental agent. I mean, you can't. Well, first of all, biological systems are variable. I mean, how I react to something is different. Some people take a medication, it cures them. Some people take the same thing, it makes them sicker. That's one of the things about living organisms. We're all different. We all react in different ways. There's the normal curve that we all learn about in school, that this is the natural range of responses to different things. The problem we've got with electromagnetic radiation, the testing has been run by the physicists, and under their criteria, unless it's 100% consistent and replicated, it's treated as being a non-effect. But because we're talking biological systems with a natural curve, it's never 100% consistent and replicated. And if you do get a really significant effect, no one's going to get ethics approval to go and replicate the study. So they've basically cancelled out any opportunity of ever replicating any of the studies that they would accept as being evidence of any harm. It's also very difficult to get controls because these days you actually can't get somewhere with no radiation. You can get people that have had limited exposure, you can get a few people that have never used a cell phone, but to say that cell phone definitely caused that harm is really difficult when we're living in a world with radiation. All we can look at are the trends and piece together the laboratory studies that show very specific things with the sort of environmental trends of what are happening and piece it together the best we can. And of course the other problem is there are often cumulative effects of a combination of different things. So if you're stressed from one thing, radiation might be the thing that knocks your body right over. Whereas if you're not stressed at all and everything's great, you might be fine. You might be able to use your Wi-Fi all day and feel great and there's no effect. But there's all those, it's complicated. There's no question it's complicated. And of course the latent period that we've talked about takes 10 years to prove cancer, you know, and who can remember exactly how long they used the cell phone, and if they asked a question 10 years later, oh gosh, I can't remember which side of the head I used it on, or I can't remember whether I used it for 15 minutes a day or 30 minutes a day. There's all the complications. But the problem we've got is, the real problem we've got is when you look at the research that's been done, it's very much dependent, the outcome of the research is very much dependent on who funded it. So the research that's done by industry, 32% shows harmful effects and 68% shows no effect. Whereas the non-industry independent research, 70% shows harmful effects and 30% shows no effects. And there's a lot of information. I've been in personal touch with some of the scientists around the world whose funding has been canned because the results they've got are not convenient for the people who've been funding them. So as soon as they go down a path and they start to get results that the funders don't like, the research stops. So, you know, there's a lot of complications here. We can't just sit and wait until we've got conclusive research, because we're never going to get conclusive research because there are too many factors that can influence it. So where I've got to on my thinking is the most important question is actually one of policy and not of science. We're never going to have a 100% answer on the science. But the question is, who bears the risk of the science that we don't know? So should we assume that radiation is safe until it's been proven beyond any possible doubt that it's not safe? Which is pretty much what they did with tobacco. Let's just pretend it's safe, we like it, we're making money out of it, no one can prove it, of course it's safe, my doctor smokes, all these things. Or, having learnt the lessons of tobacco and asbestos and all those things, should we err on the side of caution, say, look, there's enough warning signs now, let's avoid unnecessary exposure and use safe alternatives. We don't have to be perfect, we don't have to throw everything away, we can keep using technology, but we can just be a little more careful about how we use it. So, should we protect the telcos or should we protect our children? That's really what it comes down to, because of the big zone of the stuff that we don't quite know the answer to in the middle. The government response, and I've touched on it already, is to date they rejected the recommendations of the 2009 Local Government and Environment Select Committee. If anyone's interested, it was a petition by Sarah Allen and 3,100 others. Which was basically from the Atawhai Place Centre. We collected petitions. There were also a group in Tatahi Bay and a group in Waiheke Island that put in petitions. Great hearings. They listened to what we said. They called in the telcos, listened to what they said. They called in the Ministry for the Environment, listened to what they said. They wrote their report saying, yes, of course, New Zealand should have best international practice. We need to review the New Zealand standard. Yes, of course, we need independent advice. We need that. The government then said, no, we don't like that, we're not doing it. The government's withdrawn funding for Dr. Walker of ESR, who's the only New Zealand expert funded by the government to undertake any further biannual literature reviews. They've withdrawn her, sorry, I've spelled her name wrong, withdrawn the invitation for Dr. Walker to attend the 6 monthly advisory committee meetings. And the question why, I don't know the answer to why. I mean, yes, the government's committed to technology. Are they committed to technology at all costs? I don't know. Is it because they're getting poor advice? Is it money? Who knows? But harm from radiation is an inconvenient truth. We want radiation. We don't want to accept that there's harm. But we're at the point now where the head in the sand approach of, well, if we look the other way, we might be able to pretend that it isn't causing any harm, is reckless. and it's culpable. And who's accountable? Well, the decision makers are accountable, but in 5 or 10 or 20 years, if our kids get sick, our community gets sick, we can't pay the health bills because there are so many people that are becoming sensitive. Are we going to go back and find the ministers or whoever made the decisions? Who knows? My strong preference is that we actually take community action now and don't wait for the government to change its policies, because it is so far behind the rest of the world, it's just getting ridiculous. The standard that we've got at the moment, New Zealand Standard 2772.1 1999, it was controversial when it was written. It was supposed to be an Australian-New Zealand standard. The Australians didn't like the hardline approach the New Zealanders were taking, pretending everything was fine. So the Australians split off and did their own more stringent standard. The New Zealanders left one independent expert, Dr. Ivan Beale, who wanted much stricter standards. He was outvoted by all the telco people and telco-funded advisors on the standard. We got the standard that protects only against death, burns and electric shocks. It makes no protection whatsoever against any of the other effects. And the best evidence, nobody knows the safe level, but the best evidence is that biological effects occur at 0.1%, 0.01% of the levels of the heating effects. They're much, much, much more subtle effects. So the New Zealand standard, the telcos go, oh, but it's only 1% of the New Zealand standard. Yeah, it is, but it's probably 100 times higher than the level that's causing effects. As it's been suggested to me, it's like having a speed limit through town of 1,000 kilometres an hour and saying, oh, well, he was only going 100 kilometres an hour, that must be all right, it's within the speed limit. But if the speed limit's wrong to start with, it's not actually achieving anything, and that's where we are with our standard at the moment. Russia's is 100 times stricter than ours, for example. So the standard we've got at the moment is not precautionary. The public bears all the risk. And the result of this, the result is that the current New Zealand policy is actually not aligned with New Zealand laws, it's not aligned with the facts, and it's very far from best international practice. The risks are known. Under health and safety law, it's mandatory to take a precautionary approach. You're required under OSH law to identify risks and remove the risk, isolate the risk, mitigate the risk. You cannot just say, oh, there's a risk, but let's just pretend it's not there. That's not an option. But that is what we're doing with radiation at the moment. And for schools, each school as an occupier must identify, then remove, isolate or mitigate hazards. It's got no choice legally. Compliance with a heating standard does not protect against those biological risks. And there is law that says compliance with a standard is not sufficient if you can establish that the standard is an inappropriate standard. So we're waiting for a court case to run the argument, just a matter of time. And similarly, the argument is that are kids consenting to having Wi-Fi? Well, consent must be informed consent. If you haven't got all the information, you can't give informed consent. So it's fantastic that everyone's here today getting more information. There's a huge amount of information on the internet, but we're getting information great. We need to somehow make sure our kids understand the information so they can protect themselves. If we're employers, we need to make sure our staff understand the information. If we're parents, we've got responsibilities. Risk has got to be disclosed and understood. Otherwise it's not consent. We can't hide behind standards that we know are completely inadequate. And the onus is on the school or the employer to understand, communicate and mitigate the risks. They can't just say, oh, I didn't know. Just to turn to the positive, there's a lot that schools can do. Huge amounts. Places of education. Lead by example. Use hardwired Ethernet. Safer, faster, more secure. Avoid all use of Wi-Fi, replace it, turn it off. Good old off switch, saves power as well. Encourage BYODs that can be hardwired, and that has been a problem because some of them only can use the Wi-Fi. Well, parents are just going to have to learn that there are good reasons not to buy those ones and to buy ones that you can plug in. Oh, bring your own devices, which are like what we used to call laptops, but now we know that it's not safe to put a laptop on your lap. So they don't call them laptops anymore. They call them, what do they call them? Notebooks and things, yeah. So BYOD is kind of like all the iPads and all those kind of things. Some of them don't plug in, it is a problem. What school, I've been working with Nelson Central School, they're now aware of the risks, they're hardwiring everything and they're phasing out everything that you can't plug in. And educate staff and students on the risks and the symptoms of electrosensitivity. If there are kids turning up at school with headaches, it happened, there's been quite a lot of cases reported where the school's got Wi-Fi, kids have started getting unexplained headaches, go home in the holidays, no problem at all, they're fine, come back after the holidays back to school, get a headache again, almost certainly going to be electrosensitivity. Some kids just can't be in a room with Wi-Fi, and the same for teachers. There's going to be a percentage of teachers that can't either. Educate on safer use of Wi-Fi. If you must use it, either at home or at school, set it up. Don't set it up next to you. Don't set it up next to your bed. Don't set it up next to your workplace. Set it up way down in the garage somewhere and have an off switch so you can turn it off when you don't need it. The closer you are, the worse it is, basically. Educate and enforce safe practices. Yeah, read this fine print. Laptops are not safe on the lap, and even their own manuals now say that. They used to call them laptops. They don't call them laptops anymore. Same as your cell phone. If you read the brochure really carefully, it says do not use within 1.5 centimetres of your head. Do not store on your body. There's a lot of warnings. Different ones have got different warnings, but basically, and equally, even the, I'm not sure if I've got it in here, but the Swiss telecom company, they actually put in a patent application saying about all the dangers of Wi-Fi, and they just developed a fabulous new system of Wi-Fi that turned itself off when it wasn't being used and turned itself down if there was only low usage because of all the known problems with Wi-Fi, which is really interesting because in every other forum, apart from asking for a patent, they pretend it's safe. But when it comes to asking for a patent, they've got to show a reason for something new. They admitted all these problems with it. So they actually know, they're starting to put the warnings on. It's hidden in about page 5 of all your guidelines when you buy your cell phone or whatever, but in there somewhere it will be, do not use within 1.5 centimetres of your head. Turn them off if you're not using them. Turn them on to flight mode so it's not transmitting. The levels coming out of even a laptop when it's transmitting, the studies that I've seen that have been done, it's 3 times higher than standing next to a cell tower. They're high levels that come out. And if you're in a classroom with 20, 30, 40 kids, multiplier effect of all these, you get really, really high levels. Add the cell phones, the radiation in the room, just gets really, really dangerously high levels. If you go onto the Ministry of Education website, there's a study that they got done as a result of the work that Damon, I've forgotten the surname now, Wyman did at Te Horo School just down near Levin. And they did some monitoring in the school, but what they unfortunately probably deliberately did is when they were monitoring, everybody knows that the highest levels are the closest. Well, they monitored, the closest they monitored is about 3 metres from the Wi-Fi outlet point and about 30 or 50 centimetres from the computers. Now, if you really want to know the exposure levels, you actually need to monitor exactly where the kids are sitting, and if the closest Wi-Fi outlet transmitter in the room is only, this high a metre from a desk, well, that's where you need to monitor. It's no point monitoring 3 metres away and saying, oh, the levels aren't that high. And those levels are assessed against the New Zealand standard, which is only the death, burns and electric shock standard, not against the biological effect standard. So it's a bit of a nonsense, unfortunately, that study that they've put on their website, but it's there if anyone's interested. So what level is safe? And this is the impossible question. Living organisms are complex and their control mechanisms are subtle. There's no known safe level. It'll be different for different people. Generally speaking, though, the less exposure you have, the better. That's all you can really say. It's like saying which of the cigarettes someone smoked caused their lung cancer. Was it the first one or was it the 100th one? Nobody knows. Is it going to be the next one? Same with radiation. Just if you don't need it, don't do it. And what can you do as individuals? You're doing it. You're here, you're listening, you're learning. It's fantastic. Engage in the issue, understand it, and make conscious decisions for yourself and your children. Don't trust the glossy information that sometimes comes out. Actually go behind it. There's a huge amount of great information out there, and it's really easy. You rapidly see the two trends. There's the kind of telco version, as we've said, the 70% that says there's no problem, and there's the other independent version that says actually there are a whole lot of problems. But it's great. You can find it really easily. There's the Bioinitiatives report that's got a whole range of information, ESUK, which is Electrosensitives UK, there's Don Maish who's got emfacts.com, there's loads of information, Google Wi-Fi in schools, there's just any amount of information. And just finally, my message is history must not repeat. We've got to learn from tobacco, lead, asbestos, 2,4,5-T methylbromide. The Roman Empire destroyed itself with its very clever but dangerous technology of lead plumbing. They were so clever, they killed themselves. They destroyed their civilization. You can sort of see history starting to repeat if we're not really, really, really careful here. So, you know, education for lifelong learning to keep our kids' lives long. We don't want to kill off our kids with this wonderful technology that helps them learn so well that it's killing them at the same time. So that's what I've got to say. I've got a huge amount of other information. If anyone wants to ask me anything, I'll do my best to answer. If I can't, I can get back to you. But thank you all for your time, attendance and interest, and I hope it's been interesting and useful.
Thank you, Sue. I think you're happy for us to open the floor.
Absolutely, yep.
Yes.
If you turn it off on your laptop, it should be fine, but your modem will still be transmitting anyway.
Turn the modem off.
Oh yes, if you turn the modem off and you turn the Wi-Fi function off on your laptop, then you're as safe as you can be.
So the laptop's fine.
It's only when it's got Bluetooth or Wi-Fi turned on.
That's fine.
Yep. Yep. I mean, there may be some residual, but it's nothing compared to what you get from that. Yeah, and it's a bit scary with the smart meters because it does a whole lot of different things. It theoretically monitors all of your appliances from in your house to the smart meter, and then the smart meter sends messages to the local collector, whatever they call them, and then the local collector sends the combined information to their base station. So when they tell you that there's only a certain amount of messages going each day or each hour, I strongly suspect that they're not telling you the full truth of all of the different messages. I went and spoke to the Tasman network, which is my local people, when there was an article in the newspaper saying they were going to roll out smart meters, and I actually got a meeting with the CEO, the man who was in charge of rolling out the smart meters, and their, I think, accountant or something. I had quite a nice meeting, my own meeting for an hour. It was great. I gave them a great presentation and they all listened politely, and then they just all said, well, you know, if we don't put it in, someone else is going to put them in, the power company. I said, well, why don't you make a stand and say, we are not going to put them in because we are concerned about the health effects. If you guys want to go and put it in, bet on your own heads. Oh no, we can't do that. Yeah, that's Trustpower. They're in the process of rolling them out now. I mean, yeah, they put a notice, or it was in the newspaper saying, you know, if you wanted to object, you could register on this thing online. So I went on to that. You click on what they told you to click on. It says, I'm so excited, I'm getting a smart meter. Please put mine in as soon as possible. And it was only when you sort of scrolled through all these things you could find the sort of, actually, no, I don't want a smart meter, thank you very much. So it's really tricky. It's really tricky. But look, I've personally talked to quite a few people who have become electrosensitive only after they've had a smart meter put in their house. And again, it depends. Not everyone's going to get sick from it, but there are going to be a percentage of people that are going to be sensitive to it, unfortunately. And you are entitled to say no. You're entitled to say you cannot come on my property for that purpose. I do not give you consent. And they are required to respect you if you say that. They may charge you a fee for some alternative thing, but if enough people say no, then they're going to have to rethink.
So what if I was living in one house and I was surrounded by other people who had the smart meters,
Yeah, it's
still affected by all of these.
yeah, it's a problem. I mean, the closer you are, the worse it is. So it's particularly bad if they put it on the wall directly outside your bedroom or something like that. But overall, yeah, you are going to be affected, and it's all adding to that sort of cumulative effect.
It's the same with the Wi-Fi though, isn't it? You've got your neighbours all got the Wi-Fi on, don't turn them off at night before they go to bed. You can continually zap the whole time.
Yep, that's right.
You are sensitive and you're colour.
There are people who I know who are electrosensitive. I visited Brian Stein in England, he was a CEO of a major supermarket company in England, and he set up the Electrosensitive Trust over there with a couple of other people. Amazing guy, done a huge amount of work. He bought a house out in the countryside. He had a whole end of his house sealed off so he could screen out all the windows with aluminium foil to block any radiation, because big old stone house, so it was pretty good anyway. His wife would have one room down the end where she could have all her electronic stuff, and he would be way up the other end screened off, and he'd moved there because that was the only place he could find that was far enough away from everybody else. He was affected by everything. He couldn't drive his car because of all the he had to have old cars because all the modern technology in the car made him really ill, just a whole range of things. And it's a problem with electrosensitivity seems to be it can start quite specific to the thing that triggered it off, but it tends to get worse and people tend to get more sensitive to more of a range of things, and no one's very good at finding cures that send it back the other way so far. Fingers crossed someone will.
So what do you suggest, obviously people in your neighbourhood are unaware that they're blissfully sending this radiation around to their neighbours. How would you suggest you approach your neighbours without pissing them off, basically?
Yeah, look, I mean, if you've got good neighbours and they understand there's a problem, I mean, a lot of people are pretty reasonable. It's just like if you've got an overhanging tree or something, they might not have realised as soon as you mention it, look, actually it's blocking out all my sun, please would you mind trying to turn it off? And most people will, some people won't. Sometimes it's a problem if there are tenants and people come and go or whatever. I've done a letter for somebody that they've given to a real estate agent for a house for sale to say, hey, I live next door, I'm electrosensitive, this causes me real harm if you do these things. I'm putting you on notice that I really don't want someone living next door that does these things. Theoretically, someone one day will take a court case challenging the New Zealand standards if the government don't review them anyway, and we've had various kind of people looking at doing that. It's just a case of getting a team and funding together to do it. But because the New Zealand standard clearly is so far out of kilter with where we're at, and so there's a good argument now that just relying on the New Zealand standard isn't good enough.
It's a human rights issue, isn't it?
It is. It's a Bill of Rights issue, it's a human rights issue, it's an environmental issue, it's a health issue, it's a workplace issue, it's a multiple issue, and it's like it's invisible somehow. And I don't understand why. Well, I kind of understand why, because a lot of money is involved and a lot of vested interests are involved, but I don't understand why the public don't stand up and say, oi, you know, just as with GE and other issues that affect us, it does affect us, and we need to have our views heard, because at the moment it is not protecting the public.
Writing to us that they can fully guarantee 100% that what they're installing isn't going to harm our health. Can they do that? I don't think so.
And even if they do, they will never follow it up. I mean, the better thing to do, I would say, is if you can lock your power box or something so they can't get to it. I mean, don't break the law, but it's better to stop them putting it in first and get the insurances rather than let them put it in and then negotiate afterwards.
Well, they're coming and doing it while you're away. That's what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, put a big sign, I do not consent to a smart meter, and formally notify them. Give yourself as much protection as you can, and maybe start a petition to government or something, and we'll get another select committee hearing, and we'll go through the whole process again, but this time we'll get the minister to listen to us.